Hi everyone, and welcome to this video about heresy, schisms, and particularly Gnosticism in the history of the early church. So before we jump into Gnosticism and heresy in general, it's important to understand the situation of the early church at this point. So the early church was facing numerous challenges, both internal and external. So that means the early church, as a newly growing organization, was of course naturally going to face internal challenges. And by that, I don't necessarily mean serious threats to undermine the faith or its intentions and growth. By that, I simply mean something that naturally happens in any organization that's growing quite rapidly. You're going to have people that misunderstand the teaching. You think about schools that have ethoses and philosophies. Sometimes you get people that forget what the ethos or the vision of the school is, or people that choose to ignore certain aspects of it, and so on. And it was the same in the church as with any similar organization. And of course, you've also got external threats that are coming at the church as well. And if you remember back to your AS level, one of the most obvious threats was that of the Roman Empire. When they saw a new religion that refused point blank to also worship the Roman gods, that became a threat to the empire. So religions like Christianity were heavily persecuted as a result. Then you get things like differences in beliefs and interpretations, which would lead to divisions and disputes. So again, as I sort of mentioned before, any large organization is going to have differences of opinion. People are going to think the way it should work or operate will be in different ways. So when it came to Christianity, particularly in the earliest days when it was still figuring out exactly what its doctrine was, there were lots of prominent figures that interpreted key doctrine differently. One of the most significant that we don't cover, but used to be covered in the AS spec, was that of Arianism. So for context, Arius, obviously the proponent behind Arianism, he argued that Jesus was not God, that Jesus was instead the perfect creation of God, and therefore was like a creature in the same way mankind or animals would be. And for the church, that didn't sit right, because how could a man possibly die on the cross to save all of humanity from sin? Because as we know from the fall, man is not perfect. So his argument that there could be a perfect creature would suggest, obviously, that this perfect creature doesn't have free will. So that again didn't sit right with Jesus being in human form. So there was this huge debate that lasted for many centuries, in fact, over how the church conceived of the person of Jesus. And it took a long time for that to be ironed out. And it was because of Arius that sparked that whole dispute. So here we've got the first example of a heresy, aka Arianism. And addressing heresies, because there were multiple, became crucial for defining what Christian orthodoxy was. So if we jump into it then, to help us define orthodoxy, we need to obviously understand what heresy is, right? So heresy is a belief or beliefs that strongly deviate from church teachings, which are deemed to be orthodox, aka correct. So any belief that deviated from mainline Christian teaching was deemed to be heretical. And the emergence of heresy actually helped the church define what the correct orthodox teaching was. So heresies, as you'll see later, could be argued to have been beneficial for the church. And if you jump over to the blue bubble here, we also see this word schism. So schism and heresy you'll often see talked about in tandem, because they're often conflated with one another, even though they're separate things. So schism is a split or division between strongly opposed sections or parties caused by differences in practices or customs. And that's really the key difference there. Heresy is about having a belief that's deemed incorrect, whereas a schism is more about a deviation in practice. So that could mean doing baptism differently from how the church would like to see baptism performed, or the way communion is performed. So certain practices were seen as against orthodox practice. And in today's particular presentation, we are going to be looking at Gnosticism as a heresy. And Gnosticism is quite unique in that it's a broad and diverse movement. And it had a few universal tenets, but it's very hard to nail Gnosticism down specifically. But the key tenet in it is that it taught salvation comes through some esoteric knowledge. And by that, some kind of abstract knowledge, again, quite hard to nail down. So before we jump into that a little bit more, it is important for us to think about why these heresies really mattered to the church. Like, why not just ignore them, right? If they're wrong, well, why not just ignore them and just keep teaching what is correct? But the key problems were heresies obviously challenged the foundational beliefs of the early Christian community. And that could be dangerous because it could really confuse new Christians. And we even see that going back to Paul's writings right at the time of the apostles, where members of the various church communities he had set up began to get confused by different teachers as to what really was Christian practice or Christian belief. The other thing is addressing heresies was essential for maintaining unity. And again, that's something that Paul talks a lot about in his letters to the various churches that he helped establish. You know, he is very, very concerned that the church remains unified in its belief, lest the whole thing crumble. And then, as I also hinted at before, heresies can be seen to be beneficial because they actually led to the development of early Christian theology and creeds. And if you don't know what a creed is simply a statement or a declaration of what the Christian faith believes. And if any of you have ever been in a church, you will know that in any church service, normally some form of the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed is read, which is simply Christians declaring that they believe in a Trinitarian God and the nature of that God. And then the last thing here is that councils were convened to address and condemn certain heretical views. So if you think back to your early church governance, you can think about how the bishops all would meet in synods or councils to discuss important matters. And remember, the bishops were seen as the ultimate authority in their churches, in their diocese. So those would be the key figures that would come to these councils to discuss and agree upon a unified doctrine of the official Orthodox Church. So jumping into Gnosticism then, just a little bit here about its origins. Its origins are actually pre-Christian, and it has lots of different elements from Jewish, Hellenistic, and Persian traditions. And again, that's sort of what adds to the whole flavor of Gnosticism being quite hard to nail down, and the tenets varying a little bit. We know it emerged sometime in the 1st to 2nd century AD. And as I said, it's not a single unified belief system, but rather a collection of sects and beliefs. So what is the key nature then of Gnosticism? Well, it had a dualistic worldview. So if you know what the word dual means, it often refers to two things. And in this case of Gnosticism, the two beliefs were the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good. And they had an emphasis on secret knowledge. And this is where the term Gnosticism comes from, because gnosis means knowledge. They rejected the material world and the body. So they lived a very ascetic lifestyle, quite, by these days, maybe say puritanical, very humble, without many material possessions or things. And they had a belief in a distant, unknowable God and various intermediaries. So by that, I mean middlemen-like figures, which we'll get into. So The teachings of Gnosticism were as follows: that you were saved through gnosis. So you were saved through pursuing this sort of esoteric knowledge that they talked about, and you were not saved by faith or works. And if we know anything about the Catholic faith, they strongly preach that salvation comes through faith in Jesus Christ and good works, because the two go together. If you have true faith in Jesus, you will do good works. They also believed in the demiurge, and the demiurge is simply a lesser god who was responsible for the creation of our world. So if we jump back to this slide where I talked about believing in a distant, unknowable God with a big G, and then various intermediaries, the demiurge is one of those intermediaries. So if you imagine a god, like the god distant and high up, and then that god creates another little god, and then so on, like a chain all the way down, creating smaller gods. Eventually we get the demiurge in Gnostic thought, and that god creates the material world. So because a lesser god created the material world, that is why Gnostics believe the material world is evil. And then when it comes to the person of Jesus, they view Jesus as having been sent from the distant true God as a revealer of hidden knowledge, not as a savior who sacrifices himself for the world. And Gnosticism also reinterpreted various biblical stories and emphasized hidden meanings within those stories that the mainstream church did not agree with. So how did the early church respond to this? Well, the early church confronted Gnosticism and other heresies at the time through theological debates, so debating their belief system outright. This was particularly evident in writings such as those of Irenaeus in the early church. The position and role of the bishops, as we saw in the church government section, they were viewed as guardians of apostolic teaching, because remember, the early church believed heavily in apostolic succession. So the idea that their church and their faith had been passed down from an apostle to a bishop, who then passed it on to the next bishop, and so on, without any break in that chain. Therefore, there is no way, they would argue, that what they preach has been corrupted or polluted, and was the genuine truth that Jesus had revealed in his time on earth with his disciples. So this was to combat, as I say, this claim of secret knowledge then that the Gnostics purported to have. The other thing is the ecumenical councils and synods became very regular to try and stave off these heretical beliefs. And from these councils, we get creeds being developed to define orthodoxy. So earlier when I mentioned the Arian heresy, the big creed that came out of the council that was called, so this was the Council of Nicaea, the creed that came from that was the Nicene Creed, and that was to counter Arians' arguments about who Jesus was, because a lot of emphasis was put into the Christological part of that creed, defining who Jesus was in the Orthodox Christian thought. And the last thing was the church began to develop its biblical canon. So that simply means a list of all the books, the same books that we would see today, that were deemed correct or orthodox to be part of the Christian scripture. So it often surprises a lot of students that there are many, 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 many more gospels than the 4 that we have in our Bible today. But a lot of those gospels were deemed heretical, teaching aspects about who Jesus was that the church did not agree with, did not deem to be true, did not deem authentic. So they were left out of the Bible that we have today. So what at this point I like to do with my students, and if you've never done it before, I totally recommend it, is using a blank Cornell note. We like to make key notes together from our booklets. So if you've never used Cornell notes, they look very much like your normal notepad, except the margin on the left-hand side is much wider. So you would just take a ruler and draw your margin deeper into your page. And then at the bottom, I like to say count about 10 lines up from the bottom and draw a line horizontal across. So what you do then with the margin is that is your place for making notes on each paragraph of the text that you're going to write, or write any questions that you have, or note down any keywords that you see. And then the section that you've ruled across at the bottom is your summary. And then you take your bulk notes as normal in the right-hand side of the page. And the great thing about this is it means at the end of the year, excuse me, at the end of the year, you have summary revision notes already made. And if you need to go back and look in any more detail, you can look at the bulk notes on your page, but you have lovely little summaries already pre-made. So this is a great homework to do, or you can do it as an activity now, is explaining the origins and key teachings of Gnosticism. So this is like a part A essay. So you would want to go through and basically treat your teacher as if they know nothing about Gnosticism, okay? So you're going to tell them what every key word means, treat them as if they don't know anything, and you are teaching it to them for the first time. So your introduction, you do not want it to be lengthy. Remember, in the exam, you only have 15 minutes to write a part A. So your introduction, I always encourage my students to start off by literally saying, in this essay, I will. So in this case, you might say, in this essay, I am going to outline the origins and key teachings of Gnosticism, including, and then list the things that you're going to talk about. Because again, you don't really have time to make an essay plan if you've only got 15 minutes for an essay. So I tell my students to list it very briefly in the introduction, because then it acts as an essay plan for you to keep you on time, on task as you're writing. And it also shows to the examiner that you know exactly the key points that need to be included to address this kind of essay question. Okay. And then just a wee test for yourself is see if you can remember and recall what a heresy is, what a schism is, and what Gnosticism is. We had the little introduction section of this presentation that gave us those definitions. See if you can put them into your own words, because these are really, really key pieces of terminology that you need to know. And then lastly, I always like to do this with my students, just a little bonus round. How many key aspects of Gnosticism can you remember off the top of your head? I always say try and aim for 5, 3 at the minimum, and see if you can put those into your long-term memory. And then see if you can remember how the church responded to Gnosticism. And if you get stuck, think back to what you already know about church government. Okay, we've already studied that. You've already covered it. What do we know about how church government started to form and why those particular roles formed? Some of them were particularly important for fighting heresies. So I hope that was a useful little introduction to Gnosticism, short and sweet. And I will see you next time for jumping into Marcionism in more detail.